Lena Matthews was a beloved schoolteacher with a bright future, until she was found dead in a remote wooded area. Reynolds was the man who couldn't let go, his obsession with Lena turning dangerous when she ended their relationship. And then there was Kyle Stevens, a former student whose unrequited love for Lena spiraled into something much darker. 2 men, 1 woman, and a town left reeling who truly killed Lena, and what was the secret they both tried to bury. This is the chilling story of love, obsession, and murder in a town that thought it was safe. It was a cold, rainy evening when Lena Matthews' body was discovered in the dense woods just outside Birchwood, a quiet town where the streets were lined with old oaks and people waved as they passed by. For years, Birchwood had been a place of safety and comfort, one of those towns where the worst thing that could happen was a fender bender or a missing pet. But all that changed when Lena, a beloved 32-year-old schoolteacher, went missing. Lena had disappeared 3 days earlier without a trace. Her car was parked outside her house, her phone still charged, and nothing seemed amiss at first glance. The community rallied together, organizing search parties, putting up flyers, and scouring the wooded areas she had frequented on her hikes. Yet, despite the fervent efforts, no sign of Lena appeared. Then, on the 3rd night, the phone call came. It was a local hiker who had stumbled upon the body. The police were dispatched immediately, and Detective Riley Jacobs was one of the first to arrive at the scene. The air was thick with fog and the smell of damp earth as Jacobs carefully made his way through the underbrush. He had seen death before plenty of times during his 15 years on the force, but there was something different about this, something unnerving. Perhaps it was because of the circumstances. No one in Birchwood could imagine who would want to hurt Lena. She was known for her kindness, her commitment to her students, and her charity work with the local shelter. It didn't add up. Lena was found lying face down in a small clearing, her body partially covered by a thin layer of leaves. Her clothes were torn, and her hands were bound behind her back with a rough piece of twine. Her face was pale, her body cold. At first glance, it looked as though she had been placed there, but there was no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no footsteps in the wet dirt. As if someone had gently lowered her into the woods and left her to die. The immediate cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, but it was clear from the scene that there was something more to this than a simple robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. A few feet away from Lena's body, lying almost delicately in the grass, was a broken watch. The face had shattered on impact, but the silver band gleamed faintly in the low light. Jacob stood up, surveying the area. There were no signs of an altercation nearby, no marks in the dirt that suggested a violent struggle. Whoever had done this had been careful, methodical. The broken watch seemed out of place. Why would it be so deliberately left behind? As he looked around, Jacobs began to piece together the unsettling reality. This was no random attack. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew Lena. The broken watch wasn't just a clue, it was a message. But from whom? And why? The detective stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. The clock was ticking, and with every passing second, the killer remained hidden in the shadows. In the small, peaceful town of Birchwood, a line had been crossed, and the quiet had been shattered. What started as a missing persons case had now turned into something much darker. And the more Jacobs thought about the broken watch, the more it seemed to suggest that the answer might lie closer to Lena's life than anyone could have imagined. Detective Riley Jacobs couldn't shake the image of the broken watch from his mind. It seemed like such a small detail, yet it felt like the key to unraveling everything. The quiet town of Birchwood had never seen anything like this before, and Jacobs knew that whatever had happened to Lena Matthews, it was no ordinary crime. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The first step was to dig deeper into Lena's life. She had been a schoolteacher at Birchwood Middle School for over 5 years, and everyone in town had nothing but praise for her. She was described as warm, patient, and dedicated, especially when it came to her students. No one had ever heard her raise her voice, and she had a reputation for going out of her way to help those in need. Jacob started by speaking to Lena's co-workers and friends. Her colleagues at the school were visibly shaken, struggling to come to terms with the idea that someone had hurt their friend. She was just so kind. Mrs. Carter, a fellow teacher, said, her voice trembling. There was no one who would want to hurt her. Jacobs had expected this. Everyone loved Lena. She had no enemies, no known conflicts with anyone. He moved on to speak with her family, hoping to uncover something he could work with. Her parents were devastated by the loss, but they were also puzzled. Lena didn't have any issues that we know of. Her mother, Lena Matthews, explained. She was happy. She was planning a trip to Italy next summer. She was excited about it. Jacob's frustration began to grow. The more he asked, the more it seemed that Lena's life was as perfect as it appeared. No signs of stress, no financial troubles, no strange behavior. Yet someone had killed her. His next step was to speak with Lena's close circle of friends. Emily, Lena's best friend since childhood, was inconsolable. We talked every day, she said, her face pale and drawn. She was like a sister to me. There's no way anyone could do this to her. The detective asked Emily if Lena had ever mentioned anything strange in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Emily shook her head, but then, after a long pause, she spoke again, more quietly this time. Well, she had been seeing someone new. A guy named Mark. He wasn't from Birchwood, but he came around about 6 months ago. I didn't know much about him, but she seemed happy. Mark, it turned out, was someone Lena had started dating recently, though their relationship had been on and off. She had talked about him with Emily, but never in great detail. The idea that Lena's killer might be someone she trusted sent a chill down Jacob's spine. He needed to find out more about this man. Jacobs also learned that Mark and Lena had broken up only a few weeks before she disappeared. Her friends described him as intense and possessive, someone who had a hard time letting go. He didn't like it when she started pulling away, one of her colleagues revealed. Lena had talked about ending things for good, but I don't think Mark was okay with that. Jacobs now had a name to focus on. Mark's connection to Lena seemed to have the potential for danger, but Jacobs still wasn't convinced. Could a recent breakup really drive someone to murder? And why had no one seen Mark acting suspiciously? The detective decided to visit Mark's apartment the following day. He needed to see if there were any clues, anything at all that could tie him to the crime. But when he arrived at the address, his stomach churned with unease. The place looked too clean. No signs of a struggle. No broken furniture, no clothes strewn about, nothing that would suggest a man who had just gone through the emotional turmoil of losing his girlfriend. Mark wasn't home. His car was parked outside, but the place appeared empty. As Jacobs walked around the apartment, his gaze was drawn to a small shelf in the corner of the living room. There, in a neat row, were several vintage watches, old, expensive-looking pieces, gleaming in the soft afternoon light. The broken watch from the woods immediately came to mind. Could it be one of these? A sense of unease crept over Jacobs as he left the apartment. Was it possible that Lena had known Mark's darker side? Had the man she'd trusted turned violent when he couldn't accept the end of their relationship? The broken watch, now more than ever, seemed like it could hold the answer. But Jacobs had to act quickly. Whoever had killed Lena was still out there, and the clock was ticking down fast. The more Detective Jacobs thought about the case, the more certain he became that Mark had played a significant role in Lena's death. The vintage watches in Mark's apartment were not just a coincidence, they were a glaring sign that something was deeply wrong. Jacobs knew he had to dig deeper, but he also needed more concrete evidence before he could make a move. Mark had always been somewhat of an enigma to the people around him. He didn't have many close friends in Birchwood, and most people knew him only through Lena. He had recently moved to the town from a larger city, but little was known about his past. Jacobs needed to uncover the man behind the watches, the man who might have become obsessed with Lena to the point of violence. The detective started by looking into Mark's history. A few phone calls to law enforcement agencies in nearby cities uncovered a disturbing record. Mark had been involved in several heated confrontations in his previous locations, and though there were no charges of violence, there had been numerous complaints about his erratic behavior. He had a reputation for being possessive, even obsessive, in relationships. It wasn't criminal, but it was troubling. Jacobs also discovered that Mark had been in and out of therapy for anxiety and anger issues. There were no records of violent outbursts, but the fact that Mark had sought help in the past was enough to raise Jacobs' suspicions. The more he learned, The more he saw that Mark's inability to let go of Lena was more than just emotional, it was dangerous. Then, the breakthrough came. Jacobs interviewed Kyle Stevens, a former student of Lena's who had recently graduated. Kyle was one of the few people who had maintained contact with Lena after finishing school. He had been one of the first people to offer help when Lena went missing, and at first glance he seemed like an unlikely suspect. But as Jacob spent more time with Kyle, he began to notice something. Kyle was nervous. He fidgeted with his hands, avoided eye contact, and kept looking over his shoulder as if he was worried someone might be watching. Jacobs pressed him on his interactions with Lena, trying to get any hint of a possible motive. At first, Kyle said everything had been normal. He had gone back to Birchwood to visit his parents for a few days, and hadn't seen Lena for a while. But when Jacobs dug deeper, the inconsistencies started to pile up. Kyle's timeline didn't quite match up with the night of Lena's death. He had said he had been at home with his parents the evening Lena disappeared. But Jacobs learned that Kyle had actually been in Birchwood a full day before, renting a cabin on the outskirts of town. That was when Jacobs' suspicion turned into certainty. Kyle had been lying. A deeper look into Kyle's background revealed that he had been in love with Lena for years, even after graduating. He had kept in touch with her sporadically, sending her occasional texts and even writing her a letter he never sent. He was obsessed with the idea of a future with Lena, something that had driven him to become increasingly unstable when Lena began pulling away from him, especially after she had started dating Mark. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Jacobs learned about a confrontation that had taken place just weeks before Lena's disappearance. Kyle had shown up at the school unannounced, asking to speak with Lena. Witnesses had reported that he seemed agitated, and Lena had asked him to leave. He didn't. Instead, he had tried to convince her to reconsider their past. But Lena had firmly rejected him, telling him that she was moving on. This rejection, Jacobs believed, had set Kyle over the edge. But what about Mark? Was he an accomplice, or just another victim of Kyle's rage? Jacobs knew he couldn't make that determination yet. Still, something didn't sit right about Mark's involvement in the situation. Why had he been at the gas station during the time of Lena's murder? Why had he been lying about his whereabouts? The detective decided to press Mark harder, but as he prepared for the next round of questioning, the realization hit him: if Kyle had indeed been the one to kill Lena, Mark had to have known. The watches, the obsession, everything pointed back to him. Mark might not have been the one to pull the trigger, but he was clearly part of this tangled web of obsession, jealousy, and violence. With Kyle's alibi falling apart and Mark's suspicious behavior becoming impossible to ignore, Jacobs knew he was close to finding the truth. But in the quiet corners of Birchwood, where secrets never stayed buried for long, there was still one last twist to this horrifying case, and Jacobs was determined to uncover it before it was too late. Detective Jacobs felt the walls closing in. With Kyle's alibi unraveling and Mark's increasingly suspicious behavior, he was certain one of them was responsible for Lena's death. But the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together as neatly as he had hoped. There were gaps, inconsistencies, and things that just didn't make sense. Jacobs had worked cases long enough to know when he was missing something he needed a breakthrough, something concrete that would bring everything into focus. He decided to revisit the gas station footage. The timeline was crucial, and Jacobs was sure there was something there he had missed. When he watched it for the third time, he noticed a detail that had escaped him before the timestamp on the footage didn't match what he had originally thought. The footage was clearer than he remembered, and what it showed was damning. Mark hadn't been alone at the gas station that night. He was with someone. A young man, slightly taller, wearing a dark hoodie. The camera angles were limited, but the figure seemed to be a person Mark had been in close contact with, someone who was not just a passerby. Jacob's heart raced. The man on the tape looked eerily familiar. It took a few minutes, but the name came to him: Kyle Stevens. Kyle had been with Mark during the critical window of time when Lena was murdered. This new discovery changed everything. The two men hadn't just been in the same place at the same time by coincidence. They had been together, probably plotting, or at the very least complicit in what had happened to Lena. Jacobs knew now that the case wasn't just about one suspect, it was about two men whose paths had crossed in a deadly way. With this new lead, Jacobs set out to bring both Mark and Kyle in for questioning. He had already interviewed them separately, but now it was time to confront them with the evidence. Mark had been evasive during their last conversation, but he hadn't yet been shown the footage. Kyle, on the other hand, had been nervous, stumbling over his words. It was clear he was hiding something. But what had really happened that night? Was Kyle the mastermind, or was Mark equally involved? Jacobs had a sinking feeling that the answer was both. He brought Mark in first. This time he wasn't going to let him off the hook with simple denials. Jacobs laid out the gas station footage, the timestamp, and the undeniable fact that Mark had been with Kyle. Mark's expression faltered for just a split second before he regained his composure. "I didn't kill her," Mark insisted, his voice tight. "I didn't touch her. I was just trying to talk to her." Jacob stared at him, feeling the weight of his silence. Talk. About what? About how you couldn't let go of her? Jacobs pressed, his voice calm but unyielding. Mark's face reddened, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know what happened after we talked," he muttered, clearly trying to buy time. But the detective wasn't buying it. The more Mark hesitated, the more Jacob saw that he knew exactly what had happened. Mark had been part of the plan, either out of obsession or fear, but it was clear he was lying about his role. Jacob switched tactics. He knew Mark wouldn't crack easily, but Kyle might. The detective left Mark sitting in the small interrogation room and went to see Kyle. The young man looked even more nervous than before, shifting in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. Jacob set down the photos of Lena, her body in the woods, and the broken watch. "I know you were with Mark that night," Jacob said softly, watching Kyle's reaction closely. His eyes darted to the photos before he quickly looked away, his lips quivering. "Tell me what happened. What did you do to Lena?" Kyle was silent for a long moment, staring at the table in front of him, as though searching for the right words. Then his shoulders slumped, and the dam broke. "We didn't mean for it to go that far," Kyle said, his voice barely a whisper. I just wanted her to notice me, to love me the way I loved her." Jacobs leaned forward. "But you didn't just want her to love you. You wanted control, didn't you?" Kyle's eyes filled with tears. "Mark and we just wanted to talk to her, to make her see that we were meant to be together. But when she started rejecting me, when she said she was with Mark and that she was moving on, that's when I snapped. I didn't mean to hurt her. I never meant to hurt her." Jacobs felt his stomach twist. Kyle had been obsessed with Lena, but his feelings had turned to something darker. But what about Mark? Had he truly been a bystander, or had he encouraged Kyle's behavior? Kyle's voice trembled as he continued. "Mark didn't stop me. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched." At that moment, Jacobs realized the full truth. Kyle had been the one to kill Lena, but Mark had been complicit. He had allowed it to happen. Maybe he hadn't been the one to pull the trigger, but he had stood by, watching it unfold, his obsession with Lena blinding him to the consequences of their actions. Jacobs knew the case was far from over. The truth was more twisted than he had imagined, but he had finally found the key to unraveling it all. Time had run out for Mark and Kyle, but for Birchwood, the scars left by Lena's death would take much longer to heal. The hours following Kyle's confession felt like an eternity for Detective Jacobs. He had known he was close, but the full truth, the dark, twisted reality of what had happened left him feeling shaken. He had heard countless confessions over the years, but something about Kyle's admission, the way he had broken down in front of him, felt different. The motive was clear now, a love twisted into obsession, a rejection turned into rage. But what gnawed at Jacobs the most was Mark's role in it all. Kyle had confessed to the murder, but Mark had been there, complicit in every moment. The following morning, Jacobs had both men brought in separately for a final round of questioning. He wanted to press Mark one more time, harder this time, with the weight of Kyle's confession bearing down on him. Mark had maintained his innocence, denying any involvement in the murder itself. But now, with Kyle's story and the evidence pointing directly to his complicity, Jacobs had no patience for Mark's lies. Mark was brought into the interrogation room, his face pale and drawn, eyes reddened from lack of sleep. He didn't look defiant anymore. Instead, he looked tired, defeated almost. Jacobs didn't waste time. He placed the broken watch on the table in front of Mark, the same one they had found beside Lena's body. He placed the gas station footage next to it, showing Mark and Kyle together in the critical time window. "You were there that night, Mark." With Kyle, Jacobs said, his voice steady but insistent. "You knew exactly what was happening. You let it happen. And you did nothing." Mark stared at the footage, his lips trembling. He looked at the watch, the same one that had been lying beside Lena's lifeless body in the woods. For a moment he said nothing. Jacobs could see the battle within him, the guilt, the fear, the realization that there was no way out. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Mark finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then what was it supposed to be like?" Mark, Jacobs pressed. "You didn't just walk away. You didn't try to stop Kyle. You stood by and watched Lena die." Mark shook his head slowly. "I didn't want it to go that far. But Kyle, he was obsessed with her. I didn't know what to do. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't want to lose her." The confession came in fragments, each one more damning than the last. Mark admitted that he had known about Kyle's obsession, knew how far gone he was. Mark, too, had been obsessed, maybe not with Lena in the same way, but with the idea of controlling her. When she had broken up with him, he couldn't let go. He couldn't face the thought of her moving on without him. And so, when Kyle had come to him with the plan, the twisted idea of forcing Lena to see things their way, Mark had gone along with it. He had convinced himself that they could make her understand that together they could fix what was broken. But when Kyle's anger had exploded, Mark hadn't stopped him. He had watched, paralyzed by his own demons, unable or unwilling to intervene. As Mark spoke, Jacobs felt a sickening clarity. It wasn't just Kyle's obsession that had driven the murder, it was Mark's too. He wasn't a passive bystander, he had been an active participant, even if only through his silence and his failure to act. The guilt had weighed on him. That much was clear, but it didn't absolve him of his responsibility. With Mark's confession now in hand, Jacobs moved to Kyle. The young man was in a holding cell, his face pale, eyes hollow. The guilt was still fresh in his mind, but there was no mistaking the relief that crossed his features when Jacobs entered the room. "I didn't want to hurt her," Kyle said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted her to love me." Jacobs sat across from him, studying him closely. "But you did hurt her, Kyle. You killed her. And you took away any chance of her ever loving you." Kyle began to sob, his face crumpling in despair. "I didn't mean it. I never meant it." "It doesn't matter what you meant," Jacobs replied coldly. "The fact is, you took her life, and you did it because you couldn't handle rejection." The realization hit Kyle harder than anything Jacobs had said. He had been so blinded by his feelings for Lena that he hadn't seen the consequences of his actions. He had wanted to force her into a relationship, to make her love him the way he had dreamed. But in the process, he had destroyed the only chance he ever had. By the end of the day, both men were in custody, charged with murder. Mark had been arrested for his role in the crime, charged with aiding and abetting, while Kyle faced the full charge of first-degree murder. It wasn't the closure Birchwood had hoped for, but it was something. As Jacob stood outside the courthouse later that evening, Staring at the cool, gray sky, he couldn't shake the weight of it all. 2 lives had been destroyed, Lena's, brutally cut short, and the lives of Mark and Kyle, ruined by their own delusions and their inability to let go. For Birchwood, the case was over. For Jacobs, it would never be. In the end, the truth had been uncovered, but the scars left behind would linger far longer than the investigation itself. Time, as it always does, moved forward. But for the town of Birchwood, it would never be the same.